A very good evening as well as good afternoon to you, Doctor. To one all present here, on behalf of the Psych Club Manipal, I, Gaurav Umesh, extend a warm welcome to all of you and especially our distinguished guest, Dr. Matthew Cobb. A brief overview about him. He's a zoologist and a professor of zoology at the University of Manchester, where his research focuses on the sense of smell, insect behavior, and the history of science. He did his BA in psychology at the University of Sheffield and went on to do his PhD there in psychology and genetics, mainly focusing on the mating behavior of 7 species of fruit fly. Dr. Cobb has become known to a wide audience through his books for the general public. In 2007, his book, The Egg and Sperm Race, the 17th century scientists who unraveled the secrets of sex, life, and growth, won the Thomson Reuters/Zoological Record Award for communicating zoology. His book, Life's Greatest Secret, The Story of the Race to Crack the Genetic Code, was shortlisted in 2015 for the £25,000 Royal Society Winton Prize. In 2020, the book, that is The Idea of the Brain that I'm holding in my hand, um, sorry, was the only science work to be shortlisted for the £50,000 Dale Guilford Prize for nonfiction. It was also chosen as one of the Sunday Times books of the year, and the Daily Telegraph listed it as one of the 50 best books of 2020. Dr. Cobb has written and provided expert comments for publications including The New Scientist and The Guardian, and has translated 5 books from French into English and written 2 books on the history of France during World War II. Dr. Cobb, thank you for having accepted our invitation. It's a great privilege and honor to meet you, sir.
Well, thank you very much. And one of the great things that's happened over the last 2 years has been this kind of contact has become much more usual. So the pandemic's been awful, but it's actually opened up communication and enabled this kind of discussion, which is great.
Thank you. All right. So before we dive into the various topics that is in this book, I would like to know what made you choose to write the history of the brain. Because as you have pointed out in the first few chapters, it is the most complex thing in the universe. So what made you go into this expedition to, go and write a book on this?
Well, I think it was my editor's idea. So I'd finished the book on the genetic code, Life's Greatest Secret, and my then editor, John Davey, who died shortly afterwards, he suggested to me, so why don't you write a book about the brain? And I was a bit kind of taken aback by that because it seemed like rather a big topic. But I decided to go ahead with it, and I signed the contract, and then I began work, and it was very hard not to make it boring. It was turning into just one damn thing after another. I think the American car maker Henry Ford said that's what history was, one damn thing after another. And then after a year or two of working on it, I realized that there was a theme that I was kept on coming up against. And this was something that I'd worked on in the book on the genetic code as well. And that is the significance of metaphor, of the way we think about, in particular biology, but in general scientists use metaphors to explain what they're studying. And I realized that I could kind of divide up or trace the history of our understanding of the brain through looking at the various metaphors, which are generally to do with machines that people had had over the centuries. And once I had that kind of approach, which wasn't my starting point at all, and it kind of emerged as I was writing, then the whole thing became a lot more interesting, and I became a bit more confident that it would actually have something interesting to say.
Okay. All right. So first of all, I mean, as I would just like to comment on your book. Actually, I was really intrigued by it and I was engrossed in it. I was, reading it one day and my friends asked me a question. I didn't respond to them, but I heard it. I was like, I'm sorry, I'm reading this. I completely was, unaware and I was so glued to the book. I'll come back to the part where you have talked about machines and, where we compared the brain to be machines as humans being machines. But in the historical viewpoint, we first thought the heart was the seat of everything, and various, back then, if you call them scientists or various anatomists, all of them had perceived the heart to be the seat of everything. But as the transition went on to realizing that the brain was the organ that was responsible for most of our bodily functioning. How do you think? I mean, what do you think was the significant moments about, some significant moments other than you've already mentioned in the book, or you've also come across on your own, that led to the method of the scientific inquiry, wherein people would debate as well as provide evidence, and would have a healthy disagreement on topics, compared to what we are seeing lately as of now, over the last few years.
Well, I mean, I think part of the problem was it's very difficult to prove. Um, and I mean, we all know that our minds are in our heads, but we only know that because we've been told it. And
Yes.
simple introspection, simply thinking about it, doesn't get you very far. Or rather, where it gets you is to thinking that your mind and your emotions are somewhere in your body, because that's what it feels like. When you're excited, your heart starts to race. If you're frightened, your stomach will start to churn. So, simply feeling what it's like to be a human would suggest that those emotions are, if they are located anywhere, are in those kind of places. So I think the first thing is those are old ideas, which it could be the heart, or in the Jewish tradition, for example, if you look in the Old Testament, the mind was in the liver. So different organs have been the place that we've thought about such things. And in fact, in some people, so for example, in the Australian Aborigines, their idea, I tried to find out what they thought about the brain and mind, and I couldn't discover any evidence for this. I looked in encyclopedias of Aboriginal ideas and so on, couldn't find any answer. And then I managed to contact an Aboriginal scholar who said, well, the thing is, that question wouldn't mean anything to people, because Aboriginal people in Australia, for them, the mind and the land, the earth, are connected, and you are part of the land. And I think that's an even older idea about what we are, about our connection to the planet. And the thing is, what I tell my students is, you're never allowed, in thinking about people's ideas in the past, you're never allowed to think they were stupid. You've got to, they're very clever. They're as clever as we are. Many of them much cleverer than you or I are. So the question then comes is, why did they think what we now believe to be patent untruths? Why did they think they were accurate? And that's the interesting question. Otherwise, you just say, well, we're really clever, they were really dumb, and that doesn't really make any sense. So why do we think things at certain times, and why do our ideas change? And in terms of the brain, the beginning of the understanding was from anatomy, and you didn't even need to look at a human brain to do this, because there were a lot of religious problems, in particular in the West, about looking inside dead bodies. But you didn't even need to do that. I mean, if you've got a dead mammal which you're going to eat, and you look at its head and you open up its skull, perhaps you're going to eat its brain, because people eat animal brains, then you'll see that the sensory organs are all connected to the brain, and they don't go to the heart. The heart is clearly significant, but those connections, and people didn't know what they meant, and the word neuron that we use is a Greek word that means sinew. So they use the same word, or thread. It's the same word as you'd use in a muscle, as you'd use for what connects, say, the eye and the brain. They couldn't distinguish between these structures that we now know have completely different functions. People noticed these connections, and there was one particularly gruesome experiment, which I won't go into any detail because it is rather unpleasant, done by Galen at the beginning of the Common Era, so about 1900 years ago. And he showed very clearly that if you stop a pig's heart beating, you hold it so the heart can't beat, then the animal is still conscious. On the other hand, if you push on its brain, then it goes completely unconscious. And he was able to do this. And it was a well-known experiment. It was repeated. It was, written down, and the books were copied. And this was well known throughout in the ancient world, in Rome and then into the Arab world after the collapse of Rome. So this was well known. And yet most people around the world, including the scholars, carried on thinking that the heart was the center of our emotions, because that's what it feels like. You know, that's the obvious thing to think. It's a bit crazy to think that it's up here. There's nothing about your everyday experience that would suggest that, you know, you've got a mini you sitting watching a screen in your head, which is, you know, the kind of caricatural image we have. So what's striking is that when it did eventually become apparent, as science developed in the West in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, what we would now recognize as science, people not taking ancient people's words for it. Part of the problem was that, in particular in the West, people were very caught up with, say, what Aristotle thought, and they knew that Aristotle was a very clever man, which he was, and his philosophy was extremely significant for them. But he also said that the location of thinking was the heart, and so therefore if he was right about everything else, then he must be right about that as well. One of the key things about the development of what we would now call science in Europe from the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries is that people started to say, well, we're not going to take somebody else's word for it. We want to find out. We want to observe directly. And this could be, for example, looking at a dead body, doing what is called an autopsy. And that word, autopsy, means to look yourself. So rather than taking somebody else's word from it, this is what somebody said 2,000 years ago in a manuscript that's been copied and copied and copied. I'm actually going to go and look myself. I'm going to find a way of investigating this, either by opening a body or by doing an experiment. And that's really what began to convince people. And what's striking is there's no brain-centric moment when thinkers in the West suddenly said, okay, right, gosh, that experiment proves it. So although Galen's experiment was very significant, it didn't convince most people because that's not what it felt like, and because Aristotle and all the others said this other stuff. So it's a slow accumulation of knowledge, and also the realization that the heart, which was the main alternative, the realization at the beginning of the 17th century that that's a pump. It's a pretty weird kind of pump, but that's all it is. It's a pump, and it's pumping stuff around. So if the heart's a pump, okay, but then you look at the brain and it's connected to all the sense organs and it is unbelievably complicated. And those are basically the two reasons that led people gradually to accept this. And by the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, as far as scholars are concerned in the West, it's the brain. As to what ordinary people thought, well, if they thought about it at all, they would still have thought it was the heart. And we can hear that in English. And I'm sure in your languages, you have the same thing. You can hear these words, wear your heart on your sleeve. The heart is incredibly powerful as a symbol. And if you put brain into the sentence instead of heart, it just sounds weird. And I'm sure you will have the same, you'll have the same terms in your language. It works all over the world.
Yes, sir. I mean, we have a variety of languages, so we get these phrases as well. Moving on, in what's in one section of your book, I think you talk about the comparison as humans being equivalent to machines. Would you please elaborate on that with respect to the book as well for some time?
So one of the, I mean, I didn't discover this. This is kind of well known. One of the most incisive, significant thoughts came from the French philosopher Descartes, who was working in the first 2 or 3 decades of the 17th century. And in the 1630s, he wasn't only a philosopher, he was a mathematician, and he carried out dissections as well. He wrote a book about the brain, which was only published after his death, because he was very worried that the Catholic Church might persecute him, just as it had persecuted Galileo. And he was in Paris, and in Paris they had kind of animatronic, very primitive animatronic statues. So these would be in the parks. They were powered by water or by weights, and you'd have, I don't know, dragons would kind of emerge from the plant, the bushes, and roar and move. And there would be human statues who would, it looks like very bad CGI, I think, but this was very convincing to people, and was kind of scary. But Descartes kind of looked at it and he thought, well, maybe that's how the brain works and the body. Maybe that's how movement takes place. Maybe you've got some high pressure that's going down, some liquid or something that's going from the brain to produce movement. And he was quite convinced about this. Now, as soon as his book was published after his death, early scientists quickly went away and did an experiment. They got say a frog, they killed it, they looked at the nerve connecting the leg, the leg muscle, and they cut the nerve, and they didn't get any liquid spurting out of it. So there's no high pressure in there. So they immediately proved, well, that's wrong. But I think the key point is that Descartes had, firstly, he was using machines as metaphors, coming up with a hypothesis, saying, look, this looks like the kind of thing I can see in the parks. Maybe the mechanism's the same. But above all, those kind of devices existed in ancient Greece. They probably existed, I would strongly suspect, in ancient India as well, that you would have water-powered statues, devices that would do mysterious things, 2,000 years ago. But none of those clever Greek philosophers saw those devices and thought, I wonder if that's how the brain works. So Descartes was wrong, but it was what's called had a heuristic value. It led to a hypothesis and led to an investigation. And that's how science proceeds. So it was immensely useful that he had that idea. And it was also incredibly smart. And as far as we know, he was the first person to think in that way.
All right. I mean, that was quite a turnabout of events. In your book, there's a separate chapter on evolution. Now, may I please relate this to consciousness as well, because I would like to talk about consciousness as well, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Okay. Again, I know consciousness is a very complex topic as well. It's something that nothing has been worth written on to be read on as well. And you've also written about probing, where Darwin actually tried to probe into the origins of consciousness, if I got it right. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But and we've so is there any similarities between the nervous systems of other organisms, evolutionarily speaking, as well, which would give certain correlations as to certain patterns of consciousness, that similarities? Like, we might have evolved larger brains for many reasons, and those giving certain sets of functions. But is there a basic function in that the realm of consciousness as well, if you take it on an evolutionary perspective, because we anyways are trying to probe into the origins of it as well?
Yeah. So this is very difficult, and people always get a bit surprised. I'm not actually very interested in consciousness. Let me be clear, not because I don't think it's amazing, quite the opposite. It's because it is the most astonishing phenomenon, and I remain unconvinced that we at the moment have a scientific approach to it. Now, philosophers have thought very hard about this for thousands of years, and they've got some interesting insights. I don't know there's any way of testing their theories, though. From a scientific point of view, I think at the moment it's not something that I think is we can study, but we can make some general principles. And this was, I think, particularly interesting in reading Darwin's writings on this. I was really quite amazed by. So in The Origin of Species, which Darwin publishes in 1858, he says nothing about humans. And there's various reasons for this. And at least one of them was that he wished to avoid controversy, because clearly in a very religious, or in many religious beliefs, and in particular in the Christian world of Victorian England, then suggesting that humans were simply animals and no different ultimately from any other animal is a bit of a problem. So at the very least, he was cautious about that. But I think above all, Darwin was very, very careful not to write things or say things that he wasn't certain about. Now, he eventually had to start writing and addressing this problem, because in the late 1860s, his colleague and his friend Alfred Russel Wallace, who had also come up with the idea of evolution by natural selection at the same time as Darwin. Wallace started to say that humans were qualitatively different and that natural selection didn't apply to humans, that we had just appeared and that everything about us was unique. In other words, he was creating a division between humans and the rest of the natural world. And Darwin thought that was wrong. Now, Wallace wasn't doing this for Christian reasons, in a way completely different. He got very much into spirituality, spiritualism, so the idea of ghosts and all the rest of it. Anyway, so Darwin said, okay, I've got to deal with this. I can't avoid this problem. And in fact, in his very early notebooks, we can see, because all this has now been put online, it's quite amazing. In about 1838, so shortly after he came back from the Beagle, his voyage around the world, which started making him thinking about the natural variation he could see and what might have produced it, he was reading a book about the brain and this big problem of how the relationship between the brain and thought. And he puts a line down the side of the book. We can see this on the internet. And he says, it doesn't, I can't remember his exact words. He says something like, it doesn't matter how this works, because he wasn't convinced by what this physician was saying from the beginning of the 19th century. He says, as long as there is a link between the structure of the brain and thought, then natural selection can work on it, because he knew, or he very quickly worked out, that natural selection produces, I don't know, arms and legs. If you think of an elephant's trunk, that is just their nose getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and natural selection favoring those animals in their particular ecology that have got a bigger and bigger nose. So natural selection can operate on bodies. That's what it does. It sifts between different individuals depending upon their ecology, and those animals and plants that have a particular form will tend to leave more offspring. And that's basically all that natural selection is. And if natural selection works on bodies, then it works on the brain, and you can change brain structure. And thereby, Darwin realized that explains why you get, I don't know, dogs behaving in one way, cats in another. This is, well-known phenomenon. Cats are very solitary. Dogs are a kind of herd animals. They like being in a pack. So where's that coming from? Ultimately, it's going to be represented in some way in the structures of the brain. So what Darwin did was, with the help of Huxley, Thomas Huxley, his colleague, he wrote a book called The Descent of Man. In fact, he wrote two books. He wrote The Descent of Man and Sexual, what's it called? Selection on the Basis of Sex or something. And in fact, they're published together, which is very confusing, but they're two separate books. And he published them together because these are two things that he didn't deal with in The Origin of Species. And in The Descent of Man, there's a whole set of anatomical descriptions of brains of different primates. And what Huxley was able to show, and Darwin then reproduces, is that these differences are very, very small. Now, overall, we have a very differently shaped brain to some small monkey, but you can see in the monkey's brain there are still many of the same elements, and it's not a difference of kind. There's not a qualitative difference. If you just look at the anatomy, there are lots and lots of small quantitative differences. And this is Darwin's basic argument, whether it applies to brains and behavior or trunks and noses, that there are small differences can be selected over evolution and produce differences in behavior and structure and all the rest of it. So although he couldn't prove where consciousness is, and not surprising because we still can't, we can't put you in a machine and do a scan and say this person is conscious, this person isn't. That's still not possible. Darwin could nonetheless show that his principle of evolution by natural selection could produce differences in behavior by altering the brain. So if the brain, a particular brain structure, produces a particular behavior, and that behavior is advantageous, like being a pack animal. If you're a dog, you get advantage from being together, then that brain structure will tend to be passed on to the next generation, and so on and so forth. So I think Darwin's solution, I have really adopted it for myself. I don't know how the brain produces consciousness. I know that it does, or rather I have no evidence that it doesn't. Let's put it that way. There's no experiment that has gone in the way of suggesting that thought is anything other than the emanation, the product of the activity of the brain. Now, if that's the case, and going back to Darwin's suggestion that these aren't qualitative differences, they're quantitative, then what does that tell us or suggest about consciousness in our close relatives at the very least? So other primates. Well, it would suggest that they have some form of consciousness. Now, because we can't put a human in a machine and say it's conscious, we certainly can't do that with an ape. So this prediction, this assumption, this starting point is not a proof, and it will require further experimental methods, which we currently don't have, in order to be able to verify it. But I think what it's telling us is that those differences, there are going to be a small gradations of differences between us and in particular our closest relatives, so the great apes, so orangutans, chimps, bonobos, and gorillas. Now, there's one point which is different, and there is a qualitative difference, and what's striking is you can't see it from the outside. So if you just look at anatomy, you can't see this difference, but it's there, and I'm using it right now, and that's speech. So speech is controlled by this front left part of the brain. And that, at around about the same time as Darwin was working on the descent of man, that was demonstrated by a French scientist called Broca, that if you have damage to the front left-hand part of the brain, then you lose your power of speech. And this was very, very surprising, because it was a localization of function at a time when, in general, and in particular the French, argued that because Descartes said that the mind was uniform and had no structure, then the brain similarly couldn't have kind of localization of function. But more significantly, if you just think about it, it is very odd, because most things in our bodies, in our organs anyway, are bilaterally symmetrical. And the brain, if you think about what it looks like, and the cover of the book, you can see it's got this big division, and then the two sides are the same. And now experimental evidence was telling people that yes, it looks the same, but it's not. There's something different going on in this side. And we still don't fully understand how that works. It's very real. And this is one of the reasons why modern medicine will say, if you are an old person like me and your speech starts to slur, you should very quickly get help, because you may be having a stroke, because that's one of the signs. If you have a stroke on the front left-hand side of the brain, then you lose your power of speech. I'll just give you one final thing that's not in the book, because it only came out about 3 weeks ago. So there are some cases, some extraordinary cases of people with amazing plasticity in their brains. For example, there's a paper I've just seen of a woman who's in her 40s. She's American. She's been to university. She has a degree. And yet she has no left side of her brain at all. Probably when she was in the womb, she was an embryo, there was some kind of stroke. So the blood supply was stopped to that part of the brain, and it decayed. And she has it. So when you look at an X-ray of her brain, there is, all grey stuff on one side, on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side, it is empty. And yet she is absolutely normal. So what that is telling us is that although this left-hand side of the brain is incredibly important, in particular when you're older, when you're an adult, it's very hard to if it gets damaged, it probably is going to be for good. When there's a plasticity in the growing brain, and in a way, speech and talking and hearing speech is actually producing this structure, this control over language, which in this individual is clearly on the right hand side of the brain because that's all she's got. So, I mean, this is part of the amazing thing about the brain. Whenever you think, okay, I've kind of understood that, and this is clear, you then find a counter example which shows that it's not quite as straightforward.
Thank you for those new insights as well. Thank you. All right. So if I may move on to further parts of the book as well. I don't want to jump into the final, but this has been on my mind for quite some time. Uh, sorry. Um, you have spoken about the future, how we would try to understand the brain, whether it's through any sort of models or even through research, or even through either other hypotheses proposed by various people like Patricia Churchland or Dr. Patricia Churchland. But something that various scientists, anybody from any scientific field, have always talked about is the impact of artificial intelligence. So one side would say that, well, perhaps we need to grasp a better understanding of the brain, and we need to do that quickly, leaving aside the limited methods that we have, or we need to enhance AI independently and then use that to understand the brain. So which one do you think, or in your opinion, would be the best, or where do you think that which side is actually going to progress in this?
Well, I think AI, the way it's going at the moment with deep learning, which is ultimately about machines recognizing patterns, I think this is extraordinary. And clearly, there are a lot of very significant practical applications. So, for example, one of the big issues in biology is how you go from a genetic sequence, a sequence in a gene of A, T, C, G, C, and so on, that will produce a string of amino acids. So you've got a one-dimensional string of amino acids, and that then somehow turns into a three-dimensional structure. And that rule, that there must be some underlying rules of how you get three-dimensional protein structure from a one-dimensional string of amino acids. And this problem has been around since it was first recognized, and Francis Crick started thinking about it in the 1950s. And there's been no way of doing it until people gave lots and lots of DNA sequences or amino acid sequences and known three-dimensional structures of proteins. They fed them into the program, one of these deep learning programs. It's called AlphaFold, and then they gave it new amino acid sequences with unknown three-dimensional structures or unsolved structures, and the computer would then say, oh, well, this is the way that string of amino acids will look in 3 dimensions. And they could then go and test that prediction, and it turned out to be right. So the machine has been able to detect the underlying pattern which humans were unable to. For 70 years, we've been worrying about this, and in about 2 years, got nowhere. In 2 years, this computer had just kind of digested lots and lots of things, found a pattern, and could then apply those rules to other data. So that's clearly extraordinary. That's going to transform well, it already has. I mean, a lot of X-ray crystallographers are now thinking they're going to be out of a job because this machine can do it at the press of a button. You can do it on the internet. You've got your sequence. You can find out what it should look like. But here's the thing. How does it work? No idea. What happens if you give AlphaFold another example? Say, for example, you can use the same methods for looking at for detecting early signs of cancer in X-rays. And again, these machines can find slight patches on the X-ray of, say, breast cancer that a human finds very difficult to detect, and it will pick these out. What happens if you give AlphaFold one of these X-rays? It doesn't know it doesn't mean anything. It only knows about It only knows about protein structure and amino acid sequences. So these things are very, very smart, but also incredibly stupid. They're stupid. They only do one thing. So it's a tool. Secondly, we don't know how it works. And when you talk to, I mean, all the people, they admit that quite cheerfully. Yeah, we don't know how it works. They lots and lots of, they set up the program, but how it actually does it, what the rules about protein folding are, we don't know. And the machine doesn't know either. All it knows is that it's worked out some kind of systematic relation, and it can then apply that, whatever it is, to other data sets. Above all, these things do not understand context. And this drift towards deep learning, which is driven by its usefulness. So don't get me wrong, technologically, this is extraordinary. But in terms of imitating intelligence, that's really not anything, or consciousness, that's really not what consciousness is about. We do something else. People have talked about, well, maybe you could get them to, if you got a computer program to recognize emotional states, you've got, I don't know, EEG records of people with different emotional states, and you could give all that to the computer and it would recognize, say, when somebody was happy. I don't think that's possible, but in principle it might be. Yeah, you can find some correlate. There'll be a correlate of happiness. You can give all that information to the computer and it'll say, oh, that person is happy. But does that mean to say that the machine understands what happiness, or even more, feels happiness? Not at all. So I think this is a bit of a red herring, because our brains are not at all like computers, and they're not like a computer program. And above all, what we know about is context. That is, we know that the same behavior, noise, word, image means different things in different contexts, whereas none of these programs can cope with that, and they're not built to. That's not, it's not what their job is. So I don't think, I mean, we'll see. There's plenty of science fiction stories and films suggesting that computers will become conscious, the internet will become conscious, and it always goes horribly, horribly wrong. So really, what you're reading about there is it's just a modern version of Frankenstein. It's more telling us something about human creations rather than anything specific about AI. And science fiction is fiction, right? The science would suggest that we are, I would guess, hundreds and hundreds of years away, if it will ever happen, of producing a machine that can do something that we would call thinking. And that's because they're not, the way that where the organisms are organized, not wired up, because we're not wired up, the way they're organized and have evolved, and the differences between them, even simple organisms, don't all behave the same way. My computer, if I go out and I buy a different computer, I buy another one of these Macs, and I copy across the hardware, the software, it'll be exactly the same. Whereas if I get two worms, C. elegans worms, that have 302 neurons, they've all got exactly the same number of neurons. If I put them down and watch them, they are not going to do the same thing. They will not turn the same way. They behave differently. They are individuals. So that's telling us that the way that, as I say, life is organized is very, very different from the way that our machines are organized.
All right. I would like to move to a part where experiments were conducted, or other case studies were conducted. For example, if you take the case of memory, we would have the case of HM, Henry Molaison, who suffered all that, and Phineas Gage. Also, if we wanted to go for another aspect in psychology now, on a personal note, for you, what are some experiments or some case studies that was done in neuroanatomy or neurophysiology, for that matter, that fascinated you as a scientist?
Well, I think the Phineas Gage example was fascinating because it's not what we're told. So when you read about it, you read about he had this terrible accident, this big rod goes through his head, and he changes completely. Gage was no longer Gage, and he becomes completely kind of he loses his temper and is not himself anymore. But I mean, and I didn't discover this. There's a lot of work's been done on this. When you actually go back and you look at what the evidence was, Gage was indeed renowned, and indeed he appeared in circuses, but not because he was odd, but just because he was alive, because he'd had this damn thing go through his head, and so that was amazing. So people wanted to see him, but he was quite independent. He traveled all over America into South America. He acted he drove a stagecoach in Chile for a long time, and he eventually died. And his body is now, I think it's in Harvard Medical School. You can see this on the internet. It's really quite dramatic what happened to the poor man. So where did this idea about his changed behavior come from? And that's fascinating, because it all came through a reinterpretation on the basis of studies of monkeys. And a young British electrophysiologist called Ferrier in the 1870s, he was using very delicate electrodes to stimulate monkey brains to see if he could work out the function of different parts of the cortex. And he noticed, for example, that if you stimulated some parts of the cortex, the monkey would twitch, or its ears would move as though it had heard something. And there was the front part of the brain he couldn't get any response from, and so it didn't seem to be doing anything at all. But then one of the monkeys there, he did an operation, and he noticed that after the experiment, the monkey's behavior had changed. It wasn't as helpful. It wasn't as nice as it had been. And he then went back. Ferrier goes back and he looks at the evidence about Gage, and he discovers that, in fact, there was this hidden in the literature, which nobody had noticed until then. There was this suggestion, which made about 15 years after the event, so we've no idea whether this is a later interpretation, that Gage's behavior had changed because of this damage to the frontal lobes of his brain. So the way it's now taught to psychology students is, oh, well, you get, Gage is damaged and he's changes his behavior, and everybody realizes that's localization of function. But in fact, it was the animal experiments which led Ferrier to go back and look at the study and reinterpret it, and now consider, well, maybe there's a link between my monkey being a bit kind of miserable and sitting there not being helpful when I'm doing various experiments on him, and Gage, who allegedly became more brusque and lost some of his inhibitions because of this damage to his frontal lobe. Subsequently, of course, there have been lots of other experiments or studies of people with damage to the frontal lobe, and that begins to make a bit more sense, but it's not how it was initially understood.
Wow. I mean, that's something that I, as a psychology student, didn't know that, studying was reinterpreted. We were just told this happened. I mean, he met with the accident when he was working on this because of the dynamite and everything, and this went in. But we never knew that, that somebody like the scientist had gone back and reinterpreted. So thank you for that insight as well.
Well, there's a fantastic book came out about 20 years ago by Macmillan. I can't remember the title of it, but it's in the bibliography of it's referenced in the book, and you should be able to get it from a university library or from a secondhand bookshop. And that, I mean, it's a whole book just devoted to Gage and the way that the story got mangled over time.
Okay, we'll keep that in mind, Doctor. As we come to the end of this, I just have one final thing for you. I mean, one question for you as well. So if we take in the perspective of brains being, computational objects, like, they interpret the environment as just keeping in mind, Doctor, or what do you feel, if leaving aside this hypothesis or this perspective, what do you feel that we shall be discovering soon in the upcoming years, like based on the technology that's available, or something like you have pointed out, this new research that has come? Where do you think all of this is going to lead us to? Any further insights, or based on what you've read?
Well, I don't know, and that's partly why the book is divided into three halves in a way. This is the past, which is the first two halves, which really are pretty much halves of the book, is the past, which deals with the pre-computational view of the brain, and the second half is the present. That is the view that the brain is, as you said, doing some kind of computation in order to represent the outside world and to model it and to predict what will happen to the outside if you do various things. I think something like that, most people-ish would agree that's what the brain is doing. And when I say the brain, I'm not talking about the human brain, I'm talking about any animal brain, you know, so in a worm or in a human. That's what we all have in common. And then the final half, which is just about a few pages really, is about the future. And I only wrote that because my editor insisted. And I didn't feel comfortable about that because, you know, scientists, we don't like predicting the future. But this is, you know, this is a popular book. And quite understandably, the ordinary reader wants to, well, what's next? What does it all mean? So I had to write something. I think, and there's a final paragraph which just consists of a jumble of potential ideas that what might happen, and ends up with just one word, or, because I don't know what's going to happen. But what I think is the big problem, and I didn't really devote much to it because it's very hard to deal with it, and thinking about it, I mean, I could even written a whole book about it, and that's this question of localization of function. So we start off with this idea that bits of the brain are doing things. So I've talked about the left-hand side of your brain controlling language, except in that woman for whom it's the right-hand side of the brain. Or we could talk about, you know, gauge and the frontal areas, or any of the fMRI scans where you see an image in the journal or in the newspaper or wherever, and there's a bit of the brain lighting up. And, you know, when somebody's, I don't know, thinking about playing tennis, then this part of the brain is lighting up. What's that actually telling us? You know, is it telling us how it works? No, where is not how. It's not actually explaining anything. Is it even true? And the reason that I'm asking this is that it's increasingly becoming obvious that even things that we thought were completely localized and only took place, you know, a function took place only in a particular area, it's not quite so straightforward. Let's take the simplest example of vision. So vision is controlled in the visual cortex or the initial processing of vision. And you think, okay, well, that's a bit like the camera on my computer, and it's all going in there, and it's just then the signal is going to be going off and take some initial processing that will then go off to the brain and meaning will be put into it. But we know from the very beginning of the studies of the visual cortex that, and this was done by Hubel and Wiesel, when they're studying an anesthetized cat. So the cat's unconscious. It's got its eyes open, and so the initial stage of its visual processing is still taking place, even though it can't. If it can think, it can't think. You know, if cats can think, that cat can't because it's unconscious. But the initial stages of processing takes place the same. And they were able to demonstrate, this is very famous work in the 1950s, that there are cells that will respond to lines in the environment. And as you go down through the visual cortex, then different angles of line are preferentially detected by these different cells. And you've got this columnar structure of the brain. Except we now know that the activity of those cells is altered by sound. So there are projections from the auditory cortex going into the visual cortex, which are nuancing and changing meaning effectively. And this was noticed by Hubel and Wiesel when they're doing these initial experiments. They found cells that not only responded to movement, to this an angle, a visual stimulus, but were also nuanced by auditory stimuli. And if you think about a cat, what does a cat really want? It wants movement and sound. You think because it's going to see them, the rustle of the leaves, the movement and rustle of the leaves means there's a mouse underneath it. So even at the very beginning of visual processing, it's not localized, it's distributed as well as being localized. And there was a paper that just came out yesterday, which I haven't had time to read yet. The retina. Now, the retina and its interaction of the retinal cells in a mammal has long been thought to be a completely self-contained set of neurons that are talking to each other and forming very early initial processing, enabling you to detect movement or whatever. But again, it now appears that these, even in the sensory organ, there is alteration of the signal from neurons coming from elsewhere. So this was Cajal, who did the initial neuroanatomy of the retina. He noticed these neurons, but it's now been demonstrated that they actually have a function. They will alter the way that that initial detection takes place. So as I say, even the simplest of things that we think we understand and we think are localized are turning out to have a distributed function. And that, I think, is the challenge, to come up with models of neuronal activity and interconnection that carry both these insights. Because I'm not saying that it's all distributed man and we can't make any sense of it and it's all just doing, incomprehensible, but rather that the localization of function is also distributed and nuanced. And understanding that and creating models that we can then apply to new data and make predictions about is going to be a big challenge. I'll close on what is I use this in the book because it is so striking, and I explain this to the public and people are always kind of devastated about it. So we've got about 80 billion neurons in our brains. We've also got billions of glial cells, which are also doing things. They're not just insulation like you were taught at school, they're actually changing the activity of neurons. But let's just leave it at 80 billion neurons. Well, the lobster's stomach has 30 neurons, just 30. And those 30 neurons enable the lobster's stomach to grind up its food. So it's not its brain, it's just its stomach. And those neurons produce two rhythms which activate the muscles so the muscles can grind up the food. And those 30 neurons, we know everything about them. This is the work of Eve Marder from Brandeis University in Boston, in America. We know everything about those 30 neurons. We know what genes are expressed in them. We know how they're interconnected. We know the neurotransmissions they produce, everything about them. And yet we cannot explain how those 30 neurons produce those two rhythms, why they only produce those two rhythms, not other rhythms, because our computer models say, well, they should be doing all sorts of stuff, but they don't. They just do these two things. So why is it? What happens if you take one neuron out? How does the system change? We can't predict that. One thing happens in the models, another thing happens in the lobster's stomach. So the challenge for understanding really how it's going on, what's working, is that if we can't understand 30 neurons that just do one of two things, they're just moving in these two rhythms, the challenge there is to understanding the more complex functions, even in an insect brain, never mind in a mammalian brain, is absolutely immense. So my end point in this is not to say it's not worth doing, not at all, but that a certain modesty is required, and skepticism on the part of scientists, and in particular on the part of the general public, who tends to get told all sorts of things about the brain. And always remember the lobster's stomach. That's the challenge. Can you explain the lobster's stomach? No. Okay, so how likely is it that your clever theory about brain function, how likely is it that that is correct? Well, it's still possible, but a certain degree of skepticism is necessary. So my conclusion is I don't know. I really don't know. And that in a final kind of pirouette is one reason why I don't actually study the brain. Okay, so I study sensory neurons, and I've got enough problems with understanding a single sensory neuron in a Drosophila maggot without worrying about what happens next. So it really is an immensely complicated problem.
Well, thank you so much for that. That you actually gave us food for thought, and
well, don't be depressed, right? You mustn't be. People shouldn't be depressed.
Well, well, no, we are all curious to know as to, how far it's going to go. Doctor, as we come to the end of this, I would like to ask if we can see if there are any audience questions.
Yeah, of course.
Audience members who are here, I kindly request you to raise your hands. Access will be given for you to unmute yourselves. Uh, so if you have any questions, please raise your hands. If not, we shall conclude. Um, I think not. Nobody has a question as of now, sir.
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
If anybody has any questions later on, afterwards, they can email me and I'll respond to you, or they can email you and
Sure.
you can then send them all to me. I'm very happy to respond to this. I mean, this is one of the great things, as I say, about the last 2 years, is that I've been able to talk to people all over the world who I would never normally come into contact with, and this is fantastic. So I'm very happy to pursue that offline.
Thank you, Doctor. Before we go, I just want to know what's your next upcoming project, and can we have you back for that as well sometime in the upcoming years?
Well, yeah. Well, you might. I don't know whether you'd be quite so interested in it. So I've just finished a book on genetic engineering. So on the manipulation of genes in animals, plants, microbes, humans over the last 50 years, and whether we should be alarmed about it or not. How it's influenced culture and politics. And clearly in India, this is very significant. Genetic GM plants are a major issue. I've got a very good book. What's it called? GM Democracy. It's called. I can't see it. Anyway, so yeah, really interesting book I read about GM plants in India and the relation. So it's not just about the science. It's about politics and society and culture. Jurassic Park, of course. All sorts of ways that this has happened over the last 50 years. And that's to be called The Genetic Age, and it'll be out this September. And I started writing a biography of Francis Crick because my book about the genetic code, he clearly played a very significant role in that. And then, to my astonishment, as I was writing the second half of this book on the brain, I mean, so Crick co-discovered the double helix structure of DNA, works on the genetic code, very, very significant theoretician and geneticist. And then when I was about your age, Crick left Cambridge and went to America to do neuroscience. Yeah. And this, as I say, when I was your age, was kind of a joke. Okay, well, he's done all that and now he's going to crack consciousness. Ha, ha, ha. And I thought that was about it. But to my amazement, I discovered that, in fact, in every chapter of the second half of the book, except for the one on neurotransmitters, the book's kind of organized thematically. It's one on memory, on connectomes, and so on. In every chapter, except the one on neurotransmitters, Crick muscled his way in. And he was incredibly influential in terms of developing ideas. I mean, the reason we have all the connectomes we now have is because he started pressuring it for it. And because he was very famous and very clever, it meant that he could send off articles to Nature or wherever, just saying, look, we should be doing this, that, and the other. And everyone would go, yeah, we should. You're right. Whereas if he hadn't been him, somebody else had sent in that. If I'd sent in that idea, they'd just have binned it. So I realized that, in fact, this second part of his life, because basically he had about 50 years in science, half of it on molecular genetics, half of it on neuroscience. This second half of his life was extremely interesting, and that there was a story to be told there. As much about the man, I wanted to know what he was like and how he was so damn clever. And maybe, just maybe, a bit of it will rub off on me. I think I'm a bit old for that. So that's my next book, and that will be out in 3 or 4 years. Anyway, whatever you want, I'm happy to come and talk to you about whatever you want.
Sure, Doctor. We are interested in CRISPR and in genetic engineering as well. So
Okay, well, there you go. Then I'm very happy to talk to you about that. Yeah.
Sure, Doctor. All right. On behalf of the club, I thank you for having accepted our invitation. Looking forward to your upcoming projects as well. We wish you the very best. And once again, all the best for your upcoming projects and your health, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay, and to all you, I hope you all stay safe. We're not out of this yet. Take whatever vaccinations you can get hold of. Yes. And I hope to see you all again, maybe in the autumn, when you've read my book about genetic engineering.
Sure. Sure, doctor. Thank you
Okay.
so much.
Thank you very much for the
Bye.
opportunity. Bye-bye.
Bye.